got to some remote teaching practices and thinking of that pivot that you made, what successes did you have? Maybe what resources did you draw on in achieving those successes, and maybe what elements that you felt were maybe under your control, would you have done differently to make improvements to that? And reflecting on those questions independently and to yourself, feel free, if you're feeling comfortable, to start sharing some of those ideas in the chat. Because this is a great shift that we have all undergone. Really a wonderful moment to pause and to think back on how that went, what could be learned from that, not only in terms of the successes, but what you might have pegged as the opportunity for growth, because that really starts to inform what comes next and how we proceed, given that the circumstances continue to be largely the same, that we continue to look to the remote teaching contexts, and possibly to the unknown and what's coming up next. I'm noticing that we've, once again, the slides, we'll just have Robin reconnect our slides so that we're looking at those questions to prompt. Yeah, so we're seeing them back up here now, and the thought and the reflection of what went well, what are some possibilities of next steps. I know when I think of my own teaching practices, that and just the ways that we were engaging suddenly with one another, that it required a lot more communication, a lot more connection to one another through all kinds of through various mediums. Bob has a really great, he's been typing there into the chat of preparation being the key, that to think through as to what the plan is to develop a course shell and a what's going to drive some of that decision making for not only student success, but instructor success as well. Giving many options to demonstrate learning in different ways. Shelley's reflecting that was a success for her, and that's an amazing success. That's really great. It's not an easy thing to have accomplished. That's great, Shelley, that feedback from students was positive. I've heard that from many other instructors, that students really appreciated the ways in which the pivot was managed for them and communicated. Ryan sharing that his biggest success was in the student focus of what he was deciding. And really, as the ideas are coming in, I'm seeing some really great ideas about being shared about the community and trusting, being trusting with the shift, as Michael puts it, because it doesn't come easy per se, but the more that we can trust what we're doing and stick to what we maybe know and value as a starting point, I think really resonates with Robin and Lindsay and I, because I know that will continue to come up. So feel free to keep sharing your ideas in the chat. It's really great to see the reflections as they come in. It's I think helpful to each of us to take that moment of pause and ask these questions of ourselves, and neat as well to read from others and learn from others as they share their reflections with us.
Thanks, Lauren. And I think too, I mean, this is part of our underlying philosophy here, is that you take time to think about what worked well and what didn't work so well in that quick shift, because that's part of being a critically reflective instructor, which is something, being a critically reflective teacher means constantly kind of revising and rethinking and then moving forward with lessons learned on your own side of things. It's not just the students that are learning, it's also the instructors. And so remembering that taking that time is really valuable as you are planning for the future, and making that shift happen is really critical. So I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen now and just talk to you. We had some slides sort of at the beginning of this, but for this next portion, we decided that slides were maybe not as effective as simply sharing ourselves. And so I'm going to shift here at this point to talk a little bit about what we're calling an improv mindset. So if the first step is to think about what you've done, then one potential next step is to think about, well, what were the strengths or the abilities that you had that allowed you to make that shift so quickly, or that maybe held you back from transforming your teaching in a way that was really effective and powerful, and rising to the challenges that shift in March brought for so many people. So to think about this strategy a little bit, when I was in high school, I did improvisational theater, and I've continued to have an interest in that, although I haven't been able to continue that. And I was really pleased to start reading some articles in education journals that talk about the use of improvisational theater strategies within other contexts, something called applied improv. So for those who aren't familiar with improvisational theater, it's different from a theater experience with a script in that there is no script. Typically, there's a group of actors working together to develop some kind of storyline or play a game, sometimes for public entertainment, sometimes not. But in any case, it's completely unscripted. And so as a result, the team of improvisers really have to rely on one another in a very different way than they might if they all had their lines written out for them. And so this notion of, so there's some basic tenets that have been developed about like what makes a good improv practice. And one of the really critical parts of it is a notion of yes and. Now, yes and is a sense of, it's basically a philosophy of working together in a group. And it's a philosophy that can be applied in many other contexts, business contexts. I've seen a lot of medical education context articles talking about this stuff. And then also, of course, in teaching. So basically what yes and means is that for any suggestion that's presented, the answer is always yes and da 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 da. So the idea is that you're accepting all offers that others make within your team, that you're avoiding blocking or denying offers. It's yes, not no. That you're building on everything by saying and such, and that you're also through that process discovering what can be added to advance or enhance a particular idea. So it's really this sense of building and being positive and thinking forwards and collaborating rather than putting up blocks. Now, you may or may not be collaborating with others within your teaching context, but we're going to talk through this idea as a way of encouraging yourself to take risks and to try something new. So what might this look like in a teaching situation? Well, we had the wonderful experience of the March shift to remote instruction. So let's say that Lindsay and Lauren and I are a teaching team, and that all of a sudden we've gotten this news. And so I call a meeting of the three of us and I say, okay, so guess what? The last 2 weeks of our course are now going to be remote delivery. So then Lauren, being a great yes and person, is going to jump in by saying,
yes, and I'm going to think about redesigning that final exam so that it can be offered remote, and coming up with what that's going to look like through maybe online proctoring. And Lindsay?
So for me, it's yes, and we did reflective journaling and sharing circles. How can I do that in an online environment? I can create videos for my students and emulate that sharing circle philosophy that we've developed, that community that we've developed can continue online. So we've done that through videos. We can do that through chatting with each other in discussions. We can pivot quickly with those reflective journals when people are in mental health crisis or have to leave their city that they're living in. And those journals can become walking journals and talking journals instead of written reflections. So you can quickly see how I can model that yes and approach, and then my students will buy into that because we've built that community.
Yeah, and then I hear what Lindsay's saying and I say, yes, and I'm going to check in with Lindsay about all those tech solutions because my knowledge of tech is way lower than hers is. So, so the yes, and I mean, we've kind of, frankly, we scripted and what's supposed to be an improvisatory manner, but what we're trying to get at here is to help you see how you can build one idea on the next. So instead of saying, remote learning, no, I am not doing on cue, I am not doing this, you say, yes, I'm doing it, and I'm going to do this other thing, and I'm going to do this other thing. So that's kind of the improv mindset that we're putting forth as a possibility. Now, the challenge is that in this new environment that we all find ourselves in, and really in any teaching situation or any learning situation where you're getting new information and new ideas, there is a very real possibility of being overwhelmed. So the yes and approach works really well as a way of generating ideas and building creativity and helping you feel like, yeah, I could try this or I could do this. But it's also can be quite overwhelming. So we're trying to propose, or we would like to propose, a sort of pairing of yes and with something called the rule of twos. So you had on your handout, and I'm going to try to pull it up on the screen as well, a two-page handout, the first page of which is what's called a rule of twos worksheet. And this is adapted from another teaching and learning center. But what the purpose of the rule of twos is that it helps you to think through your limitations and to pull back. So you've done your yes and you're like, yeah, this would be awesome, and this would be awesome, and this would be awesome. And then you say, well, wait a minute, that's a lot of work, and I have this much time. So you go through your rule of twos to be able to focus your creativity. So to think, okay, what are my two guiding principles? And this, I think, is really, again, getting back to that notion of we have institutional priorities, we have institutional values, we also have personal values, things that we really believe in terms of teaching and learning, and that we would like to hold on to, even as we shift into, for many of us, a brand new teaching context of having to do things remote. So focusing on those guiding principles. And then working through this sheet, you can see some of the other elements that you'd also address. Really trying to focus in, take your ideas and target them towards specific places where you feel you can make a change. Okay, so I think at this point, Lauren, I'll turn it back to you again.
Sure, and one of the things we really wanted to try and accomplish in this webinar was to show you how some of the resources we're starting to create might help you along these lines of not only starting to think big, but then bringing that back in to that rule of twos. And so one of the things that I'm going to do now is give you a little tour of the newest resource that the Center for Teaching and Learning has created called the Transforming Teaching Toolkit. So I'm going to share my screen here, and just bear with me for a moment while I get used to this idea. Here we are. So what you're looking at is the Center for Teaching and Learning main page. This can be accessed by going to queensu.ca/CTL. And the teaching toolkit is here in the top ribbon, teaching toolkit. So clicking that brings you into the main page of the Transforming Teaching Toolkit. I want to emphasize that this is a developing resource, so something that is constantly evolving and growing over time as the center, as we respond to what's the shift that is taking place. So while we developed this resource to acknowledge the shift being caused by response to the COVID-19 pandemic, these resources are really focused on just generally helping instructors to adapt to any teaching changing and the changing situation, so that you can adapt your strategies and for whatever comes your way. And I think that will continue to resonate as the situation shifts moving forward. So one of the very first things that we built into the toolkit is a self-assessment tool. This is something of a survey, but it's really for your own use to reflect on those past approaches, your values, what drives a lot of your teaching, and reflecting then on those strengths as a starting point. The self-assessment tool also will then, as you're completing it, it will start to recommend some resources from within the toolkit that might align most closely with what you've done in the past and how you can leverage that into the future. The main way that we've focused the, what comes up in the future and how to respond to that really comes in the form of various Start Here guides. So there are 6 main topics that we hoped would really cover the majority of those essential ideas and essential points of focus when looking to redesign or come up with new teaching approaches given changing contexts. So ranging from inclusive community through, student engagement and technology solutions, ways to communicate with your students in remote contexts when you're thinking how that shifts from a face-to-face context possibly to a virtual one. And each Start Here guide, to click into one, gives you some strategies or some things to think about from the values that as a center we hold, but really getting at the ideas that put those values or those ideas, the best practices, into practice. And one of the ways in which we've done that is to share some resources, to have these areas where it highlights some of the technologies that might connect to enabling those ideas. So we really invite you to use this toolkit as an extension of the resources that this webinar proposes to you, to explore how some of the ideas proposed within the toolkit might start helping you to think of that yes and brainstorming, but also then to narrow in and start to fill out that rule of twos in narrowing in on what it is you're going to focus upon in responding to the shift and really taking on that pivot in with an improv mindset. So one of the ways that we certainly you'll start to see the evolution of this toolkit over time is with webinars like this. Later on at the end, we'll be speaking to some of the other webinars that come up, because really we're hoping that this becomes a conversation between the Center for Teaching and Learning and the instructors who are looking for those supports, because this improv is something that happens over time and we develop as we go. So, the resources that build out of those webinars then get added to and built as we engage in these conversations. I'm going to switch over now a bit, and we wanted to move from having shown you those resources to an activity of demonstrating or putting some of this to practice. And so I'll shift some of my viewpoint here, and Lindsay and Robin to shift to the activity for what we would like to do is have some brainstorming, prompt some brainstorming around assessments, and then we'll shift our attention more to instructional strategies a bit later on. But to start to work together as a community around the idea of improv, thinking on our feet, and working with alternatives to what we see in front of us. So this is Mentimeter. It's a online tool for collecting some responses and getting some input from you, the community. And the way this works is to go to open your web browser, go to menti.com, and you'll enter in the code that you see on the top of the screen, the 924993. Go in there, you'll see a field where you can start to contribute your ideas to this general question that we have posed for you. What are your favorite assessment strategies? So if you think of what you typically do in a course, maybe what some of your go-to assessment strategies are, the things that really represent well the, when you're thinking of when you feel most, alive or most connected to the assessments, because it's just a really great activity for you and your students. What are those that come up? And as we get people to start contributing, you'll see that a word cloud is starting to build, where ideas from the group will start to be curated in front of us. Because we were curious, Robin, Lindsay and I, as to what really does start to represent the most frequent or common assessments. And it's neat to see this build over time. This being a word cloud, those words that are the largest are more frequently mentioned by the collective. There's a greater frequency there. And it will change as the ideas are coming in.
I find it interesting too that as the words get smaller, the only ones that we can read on our screen are the big ones. So
oh no,
kind of filtering it out automatically, which is nice.
So it's neat to see a lot of discussion, presentation ideas, case studies, those elements that really involve collaboration, communication, discussion amongst not only instructor to student, but student to student. And also seeing some of the more written forms of assessment, essays, annotated bibliographies, research proposals.
I saw one that I liked, Decolonized assessments keeps popping up, and I really like that one.
I think in terms of numbers, we're pretty close to the number of people in the session, Lauren.
Great. And thanks for your contributions and for helping us build this word cloud. We wanted to acknowledge that there are many different forms of assessment, and that going through this process might help to model some of the thinking that you'll be able to then undertake for those assessment strategies that resonate most strongly to you. And looking at this and seeing what are those most frequently used or frequently favorited assessment strategies, we wanted to select one and go through the conversation of how we might alter that or take that improv mindset of, yes, this is my favorite assessment, yes, this is one I want to continue with, and I'm going to do that in altered ways to meet the new contexts of teaching. So say, does Robin, Lindsay, does one stand out for you that you'd like to proceed with as our first?
Well, I think there's been a question from Melissa about what decolonized assessments are, and I think that is an important question that we should talk about. But I feel like maybe if we go through the activity once, I'm thinking with either discussion or presentation, and then I think raising, having the discussion about what decolonized assessments looks like.
Certainly. Presentation actually might be one of the, for me, an not easier, but certainly one that lends itself to lots of discussion around what that could look like in shifting or transforming that approach. And so typically, of course, a presentation from students might, of course, be in front of the class. Lots of students will prepare their PowerPoint slides, might work either independently or as a group to really refine the message that they'd like to share with their peers and with the instructor, oftentimes being evaluated on a rubric that would include elements of how effectively that message is being communicated, the extent to which the students are able to draw on various course concepts to relay oftentimes new ideas. And so thinking about how that typically happens in the face-to-face context, the question here becomes, how do we transform that in the road ahead, in what comes up next in our teaching? And although we may not necessarily have all the answers to what that's going to look like, say, for the fall, we can start to imagine what it could look like if we start to shift the focus there. So referring to your handout that was earlier distributed, the second page has a list of various options that really are this maybe a starting point or the inspiration for thinking. And if you head to that handout and have a look, what ideas come up for you in the ways that a presentation might be shifted to to think of that option differently.
So we're hoping here that you'll either just think about this on your own, looking at the handout, thinking about presentations. Maybe you even had presentations in your winter 2020 classes that you shifted in different ways. If you're willing to share some ideas in the chat, that would be really great, because that kind of gives us that sense of conversation and sharing ideas among the whole group.
Yeah, I can share a little bit too about what I did with my college course this year and last year. So I teach a foundations of Aboriginal peoplehood course at St. Lawrence College, and I actually left the options for presentations and assignments, written assignments, in the hands of the students completely. And so they came up with some really creative ways of presenting those to me. So they did voiceover PowerPoints, they did musical recordings of them doing a song reflective journal. Some of them did artwork, and they submitted their reflective thoughts on what their art meant, so an interpretation of that art. And now I have about 5 or 6 lovely pieces of art in my home that my students have gifted me as well. It's just a nice way to share creatively with each other, and it allowed them a bit of control over how that assignment got submitted and how they chose to do that, the format of it as well.
There's a number of great ideas coming through in the chat now around possibilities for presentations, and I really want to point out the variety of things coming through. So some folks who really have no idea, and that's a great place to recognize, to just say, I don't even know what I would do with this situation. And then some ideas around rethinking presentations as podcasts, asking students to edit those podcast posts and share them, creating a video to explain concepts, others pointing out that students can use On Cue to provide presentations. They might record with Zoom. Some people using voice over PowerPoint, Prezis, website development, narrated PowerPoints, thinking about different presentations for other sorts of documents, 5-minute videos. Some people had background, and I think this is interesting again. So some of you are saying, I had these skills in production or in podcast editing, and I helped teach my students those skills as well, whereas others don't have those skills. So you'd pick a different approach. So I think that's part of what we're talking about with this flexible mindset, that you know yourselves best. We're presenting you with a lot of ideas, but you pick the idea that works for you, because everything from different things work for different people. I mean, even more things coming through in the chat now around TikTok, different technologies, 6 different options for technologies, so letting the students have some choice, as well as, you say what's your strengths, but what are your students' strengths and what works best for them. There was a question about which technologies might be more supported at Queen's. And I think, Lauren, does the Educational Technologies website, that is going to talk about which tech is Queen's supported and which are maybe other options that are interesting but not supported by ITS. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Selena from our team in the Center for Teaching and Learning is nearly ready to launch new resources that would outline the various technological options, prioritizing those that are institutionally supported, because it comes with certain benefits of having that support. For example, just being able to have the tech support from ITS and from those in the Center for Teaching and Learning, it comes with a lot of value. But then there are other third-party tools that can be used very well for supporting presentations. So even a platform such as YouTube offers a lot of affordances. For example, videos can be made private and shared with an instructor through a link to keep some thought going as to student privacy, and even recognizing that sometimes creating a video can be an intimidating concept or idea for students. And so some of the elements of tools being there to support those thoughts. Certainly, and those resources will continue to grow and be available, so that we can start to point people towards those ideal technologies, help people make decisions about what technologies might be most suitable given those ideas and concepts that you're wanting to emphasize.
Yeah, and just looking through the chat again, there's a question from Margaret about library resources. So that's definitely a question for the library, and we have been talking with some of the folks, but I think the number one recommendation that I've heard from Queen's Library as you're planning your courses is to reach out to your subject or liaison librarian, because they're your best source for knowing what's best in terms of how students can access content. I know I'm personally in touch with the librarian for music because that's my own background, and she's piled tons of online resources. So talk to your subject librarian if you have library questions. Thank you also to Carolyn for putting the CTL educational technology page up there. So for anyone who's interested in diving into the tech in more depth, that's a great place to start. And then I'd also point out Sean's final question about adding closed captioning. That's what CC stands for, I think. And then Chris Eckert's coming in about accessibility. So that's exactly what we're talking about in terms of holding true to your values and maintaining those values through your teaching. So there's this tendency to think, yes, educational technology, look at all these cool bells and whistles that we can do, and look at this neat thing, but don't forget about inclusivity, equity, accessibility, decolonization. And so thinking through those, as I see some of you are doing, is really important. And yes, for sure, I think if you go to the EdTech page, I'm noticing Margaret's comment about, can we prioritize which one's the easiest and the least? And that's certainly the way that we're thinking through this as we develop resources, is that throughout all of what we're doing, we're thinking through, okay, what's best for someone who's never even used OnCue? What's best for someone who's used OnCue a little bit and is maybe comfortable to go a little further? And then what is best for someone who loves tech, who has like 20 iPads kicking around their house and has every app known to creation all over all of them? So, we're trying to help and give options for everyone as available. I want to come back around to the notion of values and maybe return to the question about decolonized assessments. So Lindsay, do you want to take on that one?
Yeah, sure. We can talk a little bit about decolonized assessments. So I think anytime you're thinking about decolonizing assessments, you want to think about what exactly is colonial about your course. So what are some ways, like where does the knowledge come from in your subject area? Is it very Western heavy? Are there instances where you can use case studies maybe from different points of view to be more inclusive? Are there ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of knowing that you can maybe incorporate into those assessments? Creating flexibility, creating reflective practice, and building in time to learn by doing, learn by feeling, and learn by experiencing before you do the assessment that would count for marks. So having those formative and summative options, giving students flexibility where possible with deadlines, because that does allow for that reflection time and that time to mull things over before they're asked to do a presentation on it or an exam or any kind of option that you choose. Decolonized assessments too, I would actually say to try to avoid exams wherever possible in those circumstances, because many Indigenous ways of knowing lend themselves more to active learning or learning by reflection, visual learning, learning by doing, and testing on an exam or even a smaller test sometimes does not capture that learning effectively. So having assessments that really align with your goals, your learning outcomes and the goals for your course, and just thinking about the ways in which your course is colonial and the ways in which you can make sure that there's more representation in content, but also ways of delivery too.
Thanks, Lindsay. Lauren, I think in terms of time, we should probably move on to the instructional activities at this point.
Yes, and we'll invite you to do the same style of activity, but now focusing on that instructional component. So what you tend to do, pegged as your favorite, because that seems to be a really helpful prompt to think of what instructional strategies feel really comfortable to you. You feel in your moment, in your place as you are engaging in those instructional strategies. Again, heading to the web browser, menti.com, and using the code 924993 and entering in those words that come to mind in representing what those strategies are. And we'll do very much the same thing, but you'll notice how the conversation will change once again as we focus this time on transforming those strategies that we use for conveying information, engaging our students, working with course concepts. And of course, active learning, as with many of these prompts, can mean it can include many forms of engagement. And so as we grow this list, questioning or wondering, expanding on what that looks like to actively engage students, what types of forms of engagement that might include. The more you're able to kind of drill down on what it is that students are doing, what you are doing in the classroom, will help you peg those, what it is you're wanting to prompt into the future. Discussion coming up as one of the major themes, which and group discussion as well, which can take the form of either asynchronous or synchronous. And so distinguishing between those, to clarify, synchronous being what happens live as we are currently engaging, asynchronous being forms of conversation that doesn't rely on the connection in the moment. So if it's a forum, for example, I'm going on and posting my reflection, and someone else might come in a couple hours later, a day later, and be replying and engaging in the conversation that way. So Robin, Lindsay, what's coming up for you as you look at this?
I think go with discussion. I think
sure.
It'll translate across so many different course contexts. I think that would be a good one.
Absolutely. So again, as we look to the handout and some of the strategies that are proposed on that second page for creative instructional strategies that help continue the discussion, continue prompting the discussion, instructor to student, student to student, what possibilities are there? Maybe things, again, that you had tried in the fall, or sorry, in the spring term, lessons learned from that.
Yeah, it's important to note too with discussions. Particularly, I saw sharing circle come up early on in this cloud, and I didn't want to let it go by to the bottom. But for discussions, sharing circles can be done through discussion boards as well. So I did that with my students because we were used to doing sharing circles each week. We just continued that on in the course shell, the course platform, which is Blackboard at St. Lawrence. So we had a discussion where the thing about discussions in online is just setting those ground rules, setting your expectations and making sure that they're very clear so the students know how they can contribute and that they're expected to respond or whatever you want them to do. Just make sure that you're very explicit in those directions. So I would supply them with a video to prompt, and then they could comment on that, or they could comment on each other's posts and bring the discussion back around in a circle format. I didn't do a synchronous sharing circle with my students, but I did model that with the Pedagogy of Peace webinar that I did. So with the Q&A format, and the way I did that webinar was I set it up as a virtual sharing circle. So I laid down the grounding rules and guiding principles, I called them, because I wanted us to focus on grounding ourselves and learning to step forward and step back and share space and time together. And I really modeled those face to face, but then when you're online, you have to kind of explicitly state your expectations for how you hope students will share.
Just noticing some themes coming through in the chat. A lot of different ideas for how to do discussions, whether they're live or in real time. Synchronous things around, say, using Zoom or Microsoft Teams. Also some asynchronous anytime discussions using message boards, writing something, having other students respond, some kind of forum. Another theme that I'm seeing emerge quite often is it's hard to get students to stay engaged. And I think this is a great place maybe to bring in the meta level of just noticing right now that you are all in the role of a student right now, and you're in a synchronous discussion. And I think it's worth thinking about, both in this webinar and any others that you might be attending, whether the CTL or otherwise, thinking about what's keeping you engaged and what is pulling your attention away. And I will be the first to confess that in many webinars, within 5 minutes, I'm staring out the window and checking Facebook. And I think that we have to recognize that this is a different mode of engagement, and to stay focused on this is very challenging. So certainly within the Start Here guides, there's a lot of discussion about active learning strategies as a mode for student engagement. You'll notice that I know encouraging you to use the chat box is one way of keeping people engaged. And it initially might feel like, no, that's going to distract people, but actually that's the thing that keeps drawing you back into this particular environment. The kinds of activities that we've been running, also a form of engagement. There was a question about fishbowl discussions, and I think just really briefly, and again, look to the Start Here guides for more information, but that would be a situation where certain people are discussing and others are observing or listening. So in a real world space, you'd have people talking and then others just listening. In a virtual space, maybe it's a few people leading a discussion in a discussion forum and others simply reading through.
And that was one of the strategies represented in the Start Here guide, that and the student engagement piece, where we've taken an active learning strategy and explained how it might work, prompting that there's a variety of different ways you might be creative with that. But then we've also outlined how it could be accomplished in a remote context, because oftentimes there's a million and one active learning strategies, but very infrequently are those posed or suggested as to how it could be accomplished online, and it can involve a bit of a shift in the way that that's facilitated and led. So that's certainly one of the ways that the center is looking within the Start Here guides, and as we continue conversations, to prompt the creativity.
There's lots of great points coming through in the chat still, and I'd encourage you. The nice thing about Teams is that once this meeting is over, you can also go back and look through the chat later. So if you're a person who finds it difficult to monitor both things at the same time, which is completely normal, then feel free to take a look through that later. I think at this point, we should probably wrap up this activity and move towards our closing. So Lindsay, I think I will turn it over to you while I figure out how to share my screen again.
Okay, great, thanks. So in closing, we just wanted to prompt you to reflect on kind of where you're at, where you've been, and where you're heading. So as Robin gets ready to share her screen with the final slide, I'll talk a little bit and introduce the concept of it. So basically, it's an exit ticket, and you can use this strategy with your students. You can use it face-to-face and have them fill out a piece of paper on their muddiest points during your lecture or your seminar, or their greatest learning opportunity that they had during the course. And today I wanted to use that to just prompt you to think about, reflect on your teaching, where you are now, kind of reset and reevaluate for your next course or your next opportunity to demonstrate new styles or new approaches, and then begin to take flight and transform your teaching and learning. So 2 questions, and you don't have to answer them with us now, but just to kind of reflect on your own and think about what was your biggest takeaway from today. And then secondly, what is one step you can take now to begin to transform your teaching? And then, of course, we obviously don't expect you to just launch and fly on your own. We're here as support at the CTL, and we want to just remind you again that toolkit's there with many resources available. We have webinars coming up. We have many opportunities to engage with you through webinars, but also through our content. And also, we're always available for one-on-one consultations or small group consultations as well. So we're happy to support you in any way that we can. We're happy to take questions and any feedback that you can provide us with that you'd like to see in the toolkit that maybe is missing, or ones that you're hoping we will build out further. We would love to hear all of that. So you can always email us at the ctl@queensu.ca, or get in touch with one of us individually if you think we can help you specifically with your course or your questions.
And I think just as we wrap up, some other things to think about. So certainly the toolkit is there. And we've kind of left the deep exploration of that to you, but it's been nice to hear from some of you who have done the self-assessment, that was a helpful way for you to start thinking about what to look at next. So we'd encourage you to take a look at that self-assessment tool. It's not a very long survey, but it does help with some of that critical reflection for yourself about where are your strengths, what are your values, and how do you want to proceed. And then it gives you some recommendations about areas of the toolkit that might be helpful, particular webinars or other events that are coming up. So please certainly take a look through that. Just to give you a sense of some of the upcoming webinars, next Thursday, May 28th, we've got strategies for inclusive and equitable teaching in remote environments, and that's with Lindsay, as well as Claudiana Colomitro, formerly of the CTL and now over in the Faculty of Health Sciences. And then looking forwards into June, there'll be the next one after that is June 4th, selecting appropriate technologies, and June 9th, innovative assessments for learning. So you can see the full slate of webinars on our website, but just to be aware of that's what's coming up. And certainly, of course, as teaching has become a main focus of everyone on campus, our workload has risen in accordance with that. But that said, we are always happy to deal with you on a one-to-one basis, you know, to answer your questions about what do I do in my course? How do I deal with this? And we'd also encourage you, if you're in a faculty that has a faculty-specific teaching and learning unit, that those people are also ready and willing to reach out to you as well and to hear your questions. We've got a lot of them attending today. I've seen some familiar names popping up in the chat. So don't hesitate. You know, if you have an engineering question, if you have a health question, if you have a medicine question, if you have a law question, if you have an arts and science question, feel free to as well reach out to your faculty units, but the CTL is also here for you. So don't hesitate in that regard as well. Lauren, Lindsay, any other closing thoughts?
Just really appreciate reading through the chat and seeing what some of the takeaways are, what some of the reflections and suggestions for a way forward that I know I'm excited to pursue and continue to connect with others on is really exciting for me. So thank you to all of you for joining us and participating today.
Yeah, and I think for me, just I'll echo those sentiments. Like, thank you for showing up today and engaging with us in this environment and in this way. It is a little overwhelming, as we've stated with the video and the chat, but it was a lot of engagement, and we're really pleased with the level of involvement and suggestions coming from you. And as a thank you, we will be sending a follow-up with kind of a gift to you of a wrap-up of what the biggest points that are out of this session, and we'll provide that back to you as a resource that you can then take and then share out as well.
So just in conclusion, as with our typical face-to-face workshops, we do have an evaluation survey for this particular webinar. So that will be showing up. There it is in the chat. Thank you, Sandra. I believe we're also going to send it out by email. So if you have to dash off to another meeting at this point, or simply to, you know, walk the dog or deal with the children or make your lunch, those surveys will come into your email inboxes too. So please take a couple minutes to do that. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out either individually to us or just to the general CTL email, ctl@queensu.ca. And I think we are good to go. And then I don't know, I can't speak for my co-facilitators, but I'll be hanging out for a few more minutes if there's more questions or
For sure.
things that you want to talk about. But we're going to officially call it a day on this. And so you can turn off the recording, Sandra, as well.
Yeah, if there are any outstanding questions that you'd like to leave in the chat, we can field those and even follow up outside of this chat by email or by connecting with you outside of this